Shadow Chancellor, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Nick Thomas-Symonds, Shadow Home Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, Shadow Secretary of State for Education, and last but not least, Marsha Dakova, Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. Whoa, that was a mouthful. So it's going to be a bit of like MP roulette. They're going to be in and out this evening because, as you know, Parliament's reopened and they'll be called to give a vote this evening. So we'll be saying hello and goodbye at different points to them, but we'll be hearing from all of them, and we're really grateful for their time, for joining us this evening to let us know how they've been easing into their new brief, and indeed congratulations to all of them on their new appointments. So my name is Sakina Sheikh, folks. I'm a local councillor in Lewisham. I'm a climate justice campaigner, and I'm also a Labour candidate for the London Assembly with the GLA elections that will be taking place in May 2021 next year. I was going to say next week. That's wishful thinking, so it's next year. So this evening, we will be talking about from the COVID-19 crisis to what a green recovery might look like, to the new normal, but also, you know, the heavy and the tragic death of George Floyd, which is the context in which there's many uprisings around the world at the moment, particularly in the US and here in the UK. Our MPs will be assessing all of these. We had a call recently for London Labour, and, you know, as much as there has been heartbreak, tragedy, death and grief throughout the UK and throughout the world, there is no doubt that a lot of people are also waking up to the fact that we have been living under a broken economic system, that actually at a time of crisis, people whose pain was previously invisible has become visibilized. And actually we've also seen today with the England Public Health report that it's BAME communities and working class communities that are suffering the most under this broken, and the response comes from a broken economy. But also it shows us that actually the Tory party, something that Labour members know all too well, have never prioritised the health or the wealth of the majority of people in this country. They have forever prioritised the wealth of a few. And we've seen that escalate into the worst health crisis and the death rate in the UK around the world. So we do gather today in heavy times. And like I said, with the death of George Floyd in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement have been standing strong and saying that, you know, institutional racism must be spoken about, it must be fought, and we need solutions and we need strategies and we need answers. And actually, if anyone is going to be leading that change here in the UK, it is grassroots activists alongside MPs, and that's why it's great to have so many of you join us on this call so we can keep open the conversation between our MPs and our activists, because the synergy of those two is how we transform. And we know that a Labour government is imminent. The failings of this Tory government have become more and more apparent. And this year, with the third year anniversary of Grenfell and the second year anniversary of the Windrush scandal, we have no doubt that we have a shadow cabinet equipped to take government very soon. So first up, we'll be hearing from Anneliese Dodds. As you know, as I've said, she's our first, well, I haven't said this yet, she's our first female Shadow Chancellor, which is obviously something that many of us are celebrating, but particularly close to my heart, and I'm sure many of the women on the call. And it's been fantastic to see you in action straight away, Anneliese. We know that you were first elected to Parliament as an MP for Oxford East in 2017, and that you've also previously served as the Shadow Financial Secretary in the Treasury under John McDonnell. So, you know, many people have been watching keenly your fantastic interviews, holding the government to account on their ineffective economic strategies going forward. So please, we look forward to hearing how in this new normal, we can have a green recovery and an economy that works for the many. Thank you so much for joining us on this call. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sakina, for that lovely introduction. The only way is down, really, after that. Thanks ever so much. And a big, big thanks to all of you as well, genuinely, as Labour members. When I look around what's happening in the country and the incredible mutual aid that's going on, very often it's Labour members, activists, councillors who are at the heart of that. And I think that's what solidarity actually looks like. So thank you very, very much for all that you're doing at this difficult time. I was asked to focus a little bit on some of what I've been working on and why I got involved in the Labour Party in the first place. So I'm going to try and do that really quickly. And Sakina's promised she's going to very nicely let me know if I'm going on for too long. Obviously, we're currently in very, very difficult times economically, as you'll all be very much aware. We've had the steepest and fastest economic decline for 300 years, and we seem to be having many worse impacts actually from those social distancing measures than are applying in many other countries. It looks like we will have a higher unemployment rate than in many other nations, for example. And of course, we entered this crisis with so many people lacking basic security when it came to their financial situation. You know, a quarter of UK families didn't have £100 in the bank before this crisis started. They weren't financially resilient. And of course, we also didn't have public services that were sufficiently resilient either to be dealing with this crisis. Incredibly dedicated public servants, but not backed with the resources that they needed. And of course, we've seen all the problems from privatisation and fragmentation that's occurred over the last 10 years as well. So what's been my priority since coming into the role? Well, first of all, trying to make sure that those economic packages that, of course, we pushed for, that the trade union movement pushed for, trying to make sure that they work as well as possible. The furlough scheme in particular, which we call for many weeks, and also the self-employed support scheme, now we're arguing for them not to be switched off right across the economy at a time when actually, in many cases, it looks like it will take quite a long time for people to be able to get back into work because of the lockdown measures not being lifted yet for them. It appears ridiculous that people will be left to pretty much fare on their own, you know, self-employed hairdressers, family-run pubs. You can imagine the kinds of people we're talking about who will lose out if that support isn't there. We then also, of course, need to talk about the future of our economy, how we build back better. As you'd expect, I've been working closely with the TUC, with businesses and others around this. First, we've got to have that green recovery that Sakina rightly mentioned. We shouldn't be looking to be supporting businesses into the future with bailouts if there aren't environmental green strings attached. Other countries are doing it. Why aren't we? Why aren't we ensuring as well that those companies will be keeping value within our country, that there won't be share buybacks and dividend payments immediately salting those funds away, that they won't be using tax havens? And also, why aren't we ensuring that they treat their workers properly if they're receiving public funds? All things, again, that other countries have done, which we haven't, and we need to hurry up and do so. We need to have investment, especially in those areas that are really losing out here. You know, we've got the most regionally unequal economy in Europe. We've got to change that. We have the rhetoric of levelling up, but my goodness, we don't have the reality. So we're focused on changing that. And then, of course, we need to create a labour market for the future as well, one where people aren't in those precarious jobs, where it's totally impossible to raise a family on the kinds of wages that they earn under the kinds of terms and conditions that they earn. So lots and lots to be done, and all of us as a movement need to be contributing to that work. So just finally, I hate talking about myself. I keep being asked to do this and I get really embarrassed about it. Anyway, in terms of why I first got involved in the Labour Party, I mean, I think it probably started when I had my first job. So my first job, the only transferable skill that I have is washing dishes. My first job was as a kitchen porter. I'm pretty good at washing dishes. I'm quite fast at washing them. Anyway, back in those days, I got paid £2 an hour because, of course, back then we didn't have a minimum wage for anybody. And at that time, I thought, well, OK, I'm not going to have to do this job for that long. But lots of my friends looked like they'd be on that kind of pay for a very, very long time, potentially. And I thought that was very unfair. And I looked around to see who was talking about it. And it was obviously the Labour Party saying that we needed to have a minimum wage. And that's when I first got involved, really, in thinking that Labour was the answer. And it's still the answer. It's the only answer if we want to see real change. So, yeah, really, really good to be here with you all today. And thanks very much again to Sakina for chairing this as well. Looking forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much for that, Annalise. It was great to hear the plans that you're laying out that will transition us into the new normal. Obviously, I couldn't agree more that the green recovery is how we'll transition into the future. It's how we'll deal with the climate crisis, and actually reforming our extractive economy into one where wealth is properly distributed is at the heart of how Labour will lead and bring about a government. There's no doubt about that. And of course, when we talk about the precarity of contracts and Labour being at the forefront of tackling that going forward, I mean, the gig economy is rapidly unraveling throughout this crisis. So it's great to hear that you've got your finger on the pulse in terms of how we make sure we rectify long-term strategies so we don't see workers punished in the future again. My first job was as a waitress, and I think as a kitchen porter, there's long hours on your feet, so I can certainly relate to that. Annalise, before you shoot off, we've got a question for you before we move on to our next speaker, Nick. It's regarding renters. So I'll read it out. It's from Michaela from Birmingham. Thank you so much for sending it in, Michaela. Renters have been given no direct financial assistance while landlords have been granted mortgage payment holidays. Many renters have seen our income slashed, and even if grants are granted a rent reduction by our landlord, we have no protection against being forced to pay back the arrears at a later date. The question is, a renters crisis is threatening to explode. What plans does Labour have to avoid this? Thanks so much, Annalise.
It's an absolutely critical question, and it's one that we're increasingly worried about, well, more than worried actually. And Sangam Debonair, our Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, has been working really, really hard on this. I mean, one of the first things that we've got to do is, of course, we argued for that ban on evictions. Now, that has got to be extended because, you know, it's rapidly coming to the time when it will be used up. It must be extended. It's critically important. But secondly, as people will know watching this, and I'm sure lots of people have, have experienced this themselves directly, it used to be the case that Social Security in the UK at least covered your housing costs, you know, maybe not much more, but at least it covered your housing costs. We have shifted radically away from that in the UK. Now, we pushed government very, very hard to get universal credits element of support for housing increased to about 30% of the average rent. Okay, so we got there. Also pressure from the housing charities as well. People like Shelter pay tribute to them for what they did to get that. Now that's got to go much, much further, because if people are falling out of work now and then going to universal credit to get that support and their rent will not be covered, then they will really be in a very difficult situation. So we're saying average rents have got to be covered. That's shifting up to 50% of LHA for those people who like the jargon. Okay. Secondly, we've got to have a disregard of people's savings around this. You know, we shouldn't see people eating up, for example, a deposit that they're saving up for years and years and years for this short-term crisis. That needs to be protected. And we need a number of other longer-term measures as well around how tenants can be unfairly evicted. And we need the government to do this now. They've got no excuse not to adopt those measures. Absolutely no excuse. And then I would just say that, you know, in the long term, as we come out of this crisis, so many people have made an enormous sacrifice, and we will need to have a new tax system so that those people who've got the very broadest shoulders, you know, people who might hold a lot of assets, so that we actually see that reflected in how people contribute into the system. I think that's going to be really important, because those who've had assets have been protected a lot of the time as part of this crisis. Many people who don't, including many renters, haven't been to the same extent, and that will have to change into the future.
Annalise, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone on this call that we feel in safe hands with you leading on this. That is a fantastic and reassuring response. Thank you so much. I know particularly the extending the ban on evictions will be welcomed by Renters Union, who've been campaigning for that up and down the country, and the synergy again of MPs working with activists on the ground is how we'll hold this government to account and soon see a Labour government in number 10. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope that you can stick around to the end of the call. If so, we'll have some more questions for you, but if not, no worries, and lovely to have heard from you. Right, on to, I told you it's going to be a bit like MP Russian roulette. It's going to be dum dum dum. I feel like I'm in a rally, folks. I'm in my living room. Right, next we have, I better just find my bio. Oh, dearie me, it's disappeared. Right, next we have Nick Thomas Symonds, who's the MP for Torfaen since 2015. Now, before entering Parliament, Nick trained as a barrister and has also penned 2 biographies about Labour politicians, so do check them out. He's penned Attlee, A Life of Politics, and Nye, The Political Life of Nye Bevins. And I think currently he's working on his 3rd biography around Harold Wilson, so no doubt you'll be ordering them as we speak, folks, but not too soon, so we can pay sharp attention to what Nick has to say to us. Thank you for joining us, Nick, and congratulations on your new appointment as Shadow Home Secretary. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Sakina. And as a new member of the Shadow Cabinet, it's very frustrating not to be out meeting people, but it is wonderful to have thousands of people on this call and to have the opportunity to build the important links that you've referred to between activists and MPs working together to get that Labour government that we all want to see. Now, why did I get involved in politics? Why was I inspired to give my life to this? Well, it is partly to do with my parents. My father was a steel worker, my mother was a factory worker, and their work on pay and conditions was very important to me. But the person who more than anybody inspired me to get involved in politics was my grandmother. And she always inspired me because her lifelong ambition was to become a nurse. And she wasn't able to achieve it until she was 56. And her determination to achieve what she wanted to always gave me inspiration, but also the things that she said to me. I used to say about how unhappy I was about the world I saw around me in the South Wales Valley I grew up in, the one I now represent, as Margaret Thatcher laid destruction to the industry in it. And I used to say that things had to change. And she said, well, if you want to change things, there's only one way to do it, and that's to get involved in politics. And the principle that I always remember is from Aneurin Bevan, about whom, as Sakina said, I spent happy times writing about before I entered politics. And he was also my grandmother's political inspiration. And this is a quote from him that really does inspire me. And he said, not even the apparently enlightened principle of the greatest good for the greatest number can excuse indifference to individual suffering. There is no test for progress other than its impact on the individual. And it's that principle that I want to bring to my work as Shadow Home Secretary. And when we see that appalling death of George Floyd in the United States, it is appalling and awful. And it is a painful reminder as well about the fact that the fight against injustice and the need to stand up against racism and prejudice around the world is as much a challenge for this political generation as it has been for others. And that's what we as a Labour movement will do. We were the first political party to pass a piece of legislation outlawing discrimination in the Race Relations Act of 1965. And I know that our movement once again will be campaigning on these crucial issues. Now, in my job as Shadow Home Secretary, what I'm trying to do first and foremost is to hold the government to account. And I set out in my early days in the job that tackling and dealing with domestic abuse was going to be a top priority of mine, would be a top priority in any circumstances, but particularly in the circumstances of the coronavirus crisis and the lockdown, when domestic abuse, I'm afraid, did increase quite dramatically. And what I tried to do was to put pressure on the government to get out there to announce that if I were the Home Secretary, I would be ring-fencing money to go to the domestic abuse and the wider violence against women and girls sector, to really push the government as well for those specialised services, particularly for migrant women, because a victim is a victim and we stand with every single one of them. And to push the government into making an announcement that they would ring-fence 75 million was very important, but I'm in no doubt whatsoever as well that we now have to ensure that money gets to the front line. Similarly, around the immigration bill, to call out the Tory hypocrisy of on a Thursday night clapping NHS staff, clapping carers and frontline workers, and then telling them on a Monday that 180,000 of them are not welcome in this country and apparently to be deemed unskilled. They had to be called out on it, and pressure had to be put on them about the NHS surcharge, where they are charging people for using the NHS. Now, we have to be targeted as an opposition. There are so many things I'd love a Labour government to do far more widely than the concessions we've got. But the concession on the NHS surcharge we pressured them into was an important one. And look, I think that a core part of our mission is to tackle crime, is to bring about social justice. And I'm passionate about the role Labour can play in that in the years ahead. And I've seen in the community I grew up in the effect that crime can have. But together, what we have to do to get that Labour government is to get that message across that Labour will keep you, your family and your community safe. And in the meantime, let's, working together as MPs and activists, try and get this government to be held to account, and also to try and help and do all we can for the people that we represent and the people that we all came into politics to improve the lives of. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I have to say, between yourself and Annalise, I've never seen panelists who are so succinct in getting their points across. Thank you so much for enabling other people on the panel to also be able to contribute. Nick, it was fantastic to hear about the work that you've done on domestic abuse and ensuring that the government ring fences money accordingly. As a councillor in Lewisham, I have seen what 10 years of austerity has done in terms of being able to deliver frontline services, and the Tory government has stripped local government to its knees. So we have to be absolutely clear as we go forward that frontline services can only be prioritised if they properly start funding local government again, and the work that you're doing on leading this is really, really welcomed, and we are very grateful for it. Particularly thank you for drawing our attention to the immigration bill. Absolutely, I think nothing makes clearer the hypocrisy of this government and indeed their intent to continue on the hostile environment. We know that it is only the Labour Party that can actually lead on redefining a narrative and owning a narrative around immigration, rechanging the language and leading the fight on their prejudice and their bigotry. So we look forward to working with you on that in the future. So Nick, before we have you love us and leave us, we've got a question for you from Victoria Brignell in Hammersmith. What is Labour doing to support refugees and asylum seekers during the coronavirus crisis? Thank you, Victoria, for that question. Nick, over to you.
Yes, absolutely crucial issue. We stand up for vulnerable people, and we will always be a welcoming country to those who seek refuge and those who seek asylum here in this country. And the one thing I was trying to do on the week of the immigration bill was to change the debate away from the terrible way in which the Tories have been trying to frame it in recent years, and to move it back to where we do as a country show a sense of compassion, show a sense of fairness, and genuinely talk about those who require our assistance. So what I've been doing on that issue throughout this crisis is to keep the pressure up on the government. I would love to be the Home Secretary who is able to actually give more practical help and to actually put things into law to be able to do that. But clearly we've got to win a general election for me to be able to do that. But be assured that in the role I have and the platform that I've got, I will continue to speak up for compassion and for helping all those who need it, those who are here as asylum seekers and indeed refugees. We will always do that as a Labour movement. It's in our DNA, and rest assured I'll be at the forefront of it.
Absolutely, Nick. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more with you. It's in our DNA, and we will be standing in solidarity with you in that fight. Thank you so much for your time this evening. It would be great, obviously, if you can stick around, we'll be able to throw some more questions your way, but also we know that you might have to run off to do your vote, so no worries at all. Next up, we have the brilliant Lisa Nandy. I'm sure many of you know already about Lisa, but here is a little introduction. Lisa, in her new role, is Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Before entering Parliament, Lisa previously worked for youth homelessness charity Centrepoint, and then as a senior policy advisor for the Children's Society, and since entering Parliament has served on the front bench, as it were, in a number of different roles. I'm sure many of you who've seen Lisa's performance on the media know exactly why. She was previously a councillor in Fulham, and it is great to have you join us this evening, Lisa. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I should point out that, because there are a few of the old Hammersmith gang on, that I was actually in the Hammersmith camp, not the Fulham camp, before I went back home up north. But big shout out to Fulham as well. I just wanted to start with a huge thank you to all of you who've been in touch in the last few weeks. I'm sure that the others on the call have had the same, but it's been so lovely to get so many messages from Labour Party members across the country. I'm very aware that foreign affairs is an area where Labour has led the world, and this is an awesome responsibility, not just in government, but in opposition, where we really have the opportunity to shape what this government does and the role that Britain plays, whether we stand up for progressive values or whether we allow the world to retreat. But as I've also known since I worked a long time ago for one of the Labour MPs who was at the time opposing the Iraq war, it's also one of the most difficult areas, and it provokes very strong feelings, often for very good reason. And over the last few years, we've had real divisions in this party over Brexit, and many of us still bear the scars of that. It's one of the reasons why I'm very, very grateful to Emily Thornberry, who's been a great friend to me over the last 10 years in Parliament. And I've watched her over the last few years being more than a match for the Tories. She's responded in such a typically kind and generous way to my appointment, and her team helped us get up and running very, very fast so that we could work with the government, challenging them where they were getting it wrong, but making sure that ultimately we got thousands of British people home from abroad who were stranded because of COVID. And I'm grateful to all the Labour MPs and councillors as well who sent us those cases and helped us to make a difference. I'm really determined that Emily's is the spirit in which we move forward. We're a united party, but we're never uniform. And we should never be afraid of debate. We have knowledge and connections across our movement, and we're going to need those, because the Tories' global Britain is an isolationist approach at exactly the moment when we need to be reaching out to the world. COVID-19 is the best example that we could possibly have, that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable across the world. And we will need to draw on the knowledge, the connections and the experience across our movement in order to provide not just an opposition to the Tory global Britain, but an alternative. Now, I know there are a lot of issues that members want to talk about, and I'm very determined that we will reach out and we'll be accessible to the wider Labour movement. The challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up, particularly the appalling lack of global leadership, the annexation of the West Bank, our future relationship with Europe, the horrifying events in America over recent days, the human rights breaches across the world that are happening under the cover of COVID, whether that's in Turkey, Hong Kong, Kashmir or elsewhere. We've got an amazing team, a shadow team, Catherine West, who leads on Europe and the Americas, Wayne David on the Middle East and North Africa, Ray Collins on the United Nations and the Commonwealth and the Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative in the House of Lords, Stephen Doughty on Africa and Stephen Kinnock on Asia and the Pacific, and Sarah Owen, who is the new MP for Luton and is the team's PPS. We will be reaching out across the Labour movement over the next few weeks and months, and we welcome conversations with you about how we get this right. In the last few weeks, Keir and I have been prioritising reaching out to world leaders and to trade unions to build our response to what is a major global challenge. We've been working with prime ministers and progressive leaders in Australia and New Zealand, Spain, France, Germany, Sweden, and across the EU. Labour has stayed in PES, the progressive grouping of socialist parties across Europe, as a symbol and a statement that our relationship with our European friends and allies will continue to matter. We've left the EU and we're negotiating a trade deal, but that doesn't mean that we won't continue to reach out to those progressive parties across Europe who've provided strong alliances over recent years. Now, COVID-19 throws up many challenges, but none are greater than the challenge of global cooperation. And the world currently faces a choice, whether we pull together or we pull apart. And already you can see that the forces are lining up here and across the world to argue that our response to COVID-19 is to close borders, is to scapegoat migrants and to attack global institutions like the World Health Organization that have helped to save lives here and across the world. Now, this is a battle that we have to win, to restate our values to internationalism, to equality, to human rights, to tackling global poverty, and to demonstrate what they mean in a world where many of the major global players are providing the opposite of progressive leaders. Democratic values are under threat, and where our ability to tackle climate change and other global challenges will depend on our willingness to look outwards to the world. So we've been working through the National Policy Forum to finalise a consultation document that has gone out to members in which we ask about the values that should underpin our approach to the rest of the world. And I'd really urge members who are on this call to send us responses to that. It's really, really crucial that we get this right, because Labour only wins when we have a story to tell about the future. And this is as important in foreign policy and Britain's relationship with the world as it is in domestic policy. We must be a proud, self-confident, outward-looking country, and we've got to win that argument with the public. Now, I believe that we can. We're the party of Robin Cook's ethical foreign policy and Margaret Beckett's global leadership on multilateral disarmament. We created the Human Rights Act, we established the Department for International Development, and we created the world's first Climate Change Act, and cancelled up to 100% of third world debt. At moments when it mattered, our movement stepped up and showed leadership, and we can do it again. So you're going to see an approach from the front bench that is just as ambitious, reaching out not just across our labour movement, but building those international alliances at state and civil society level that will help us win this argument and win a general election. Now, we've already started this work with the help of our amazing trade union movement and with diaspora communities here in the UK, whose global connections are a major source of our grassroots strength. I am determined that we won't just be commentators over the next 4 years. We're going to be active participants in the battle that is to come. Now, that's a huge challenge. It's going to take a team effort, and I'm really looking forward to working with all of you to get this right.
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. It was really, really great to hear about the national policy for, consultation that Labour is currently undertaking. We couldn't agree more that actually in this time of crisis and in the ability to have a just recovery, that we will see a shift in values, a shift in the values that underpin our economy, a shift in the values that underpin our society, and as you said, a shift in the values that will underpin the way that we approach our role in the world. So it's really fantastic to hear that you and the team are leading on how we reshape those internationalist values in Labour. We absolutely agree that those are the absolute core part of the DNA of the Labour movement. And this, the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has shown us clear as day that actually we are all interconnected, that we have a deep interdependence, not only of people across the UK, but indeed the world. So as you've correctly said, with the government having this kind of dangerous and reckless isolationist mentality, we are going to need now more than ever a Labour Party holding them to account. And it's great that you gave us an introduction to your team as well as your agenda. We're looking so forward to seeing the work that you guys bring out, and we will be standing right behind you and alongside you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Right, before we have you love us and leave us as well, we are going to give you a question from Sujit from Newham, and I have to say my apologies to the wonderful people of Hammersmith as well. I'm a Southeast Londoner, so maybe I can be given the small forgiveness of ignorance. We stick to down south of the river here. But Sujit from Newham takes us to East London. She asks us, if Labour wins the next general election, will we ban arms sales and sales of parts of regressive regime to regressive regimes like Saudi Arabia? Over to you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for that question, because one of the people that we've got working with our team and with John Healey's defence team is Fabian Hamilton, who is the Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament. This was a role that Jeremy Corbyn created a few years ago, and that Keir and I were very, very keen that we keep, because making the world a safer place is the top priority. You only need to look at what has happened over the last few years to see how dangerous a moment that we're currently in. And before I came into Parliament, I worked with child refugees in the voluntary sector. It was that really led me into Parliament, seeing the courage and determination that those young people had shown, and how often it just wasn't matched by our ambition for them. And that is what shapes a lot of my outlook around this. I voted against Trident renewal because I believe in the end that nuclear weapons make the world a less safe place. I want to see a serious programme of multilateral disarmament, and to see us get back to a place where Labour is leading the world in that regard. And there are a number of instances at the moment where the UK is doing precisely the opposite, where we are selling arms to some of the most oppressive regimes in the world. And it's something that I've challenged over and over again. Before I became the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I was the chair of Labour Friends of Palestine and the Middle East. And it's something that I and many colleagues have stood up and fought for over and over again. Labour has to be, I think it was Harold Wilson who said that Labour is a moral crusade or it is nothing at all. And I think that the country is badly crying out for that sort of moral leadership at the moment. They can see that the current system isn't working and they want to see an alternative. And I'm absolutely determined that on that issue, as well as many others, that Labour is going to provide it.
Lisa, thank you so much for that answer and for joining us this evening. We look forward to working with you together, and we hope that you can stay on the course so we can throw a couple more questions your way. But like we said, no worries at all if not, because we know that there's a MP roulette with the votes going on in Parliament at the moment. Now, next up, we have the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's been the MP for Salford and Eccles since 2015. Rebecca was a pioneer of the Green Industrial Revolution, something that I was a big personal fan of and had the pleasure of working with Rebecca on, and something that has given us the foundations for the conversation that we're having around a green recovery. Rebecca has obviously been working closely with the National Education Union to ensure a safe return to schools this week in her new role as Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us on this call this evening, and over to you.
Thanks, Sakina. And just to let everybody on the call know that Sakina had one of the greatest campaign slogans I've ever heard in my entire life when she was running for London Assembly, Shake City Hall, obviously because she's called Sakina Shake. I thought that was brilliant. So obviously, I think you know now that I am Rebecca Long-Bailey and I'm the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. And there's certainly been a spotlight shone on education throughout this crisis. And over the last month or so, we've seen what the government's proposals were for sending children back to school. And we all want our children to go back into schools. We know that it's the best place for their well-being and for their academic education. But the way the government handled this was wrong on so many levels. And 2 weeks ago, the government issued a date. They said they wanted to reopen on the 1st of June. They wanted reception year 1 and year 6 back into school. And then a few weeks later, the proposals were to open schools in full to allow children to have some time in school before we broke for the summer holidays. Now, the guidance that they issued alongside that was deficient in so many areas. And as a result of that, many of the trade unions, the National Education Union, one of them, put together a list of tests that the government needed to meet. And they were very reasonable tests relating to test, track and trace, relating to making sure we had stringent social distancing measures in relation to lowering the current infectivity levels to a manageable rate, making sure that those teachers, school staff and children who were vulnerable or lived with vulnerable family members had the opportunity to protect themselves and to exempt themselves from the school environment if they were at risk. And the trade unions and the Labour Party repeatedly asked the government to create what we call a task force, to bring together those experts, to set a list of priorities and principles that every single school would have to meet before they reopened to pupils. And unfortunately, the government didn't do that. And we're now in a situation where many schools have tried to do the right thing. Many local authorities have tried to do the right thing. They've tried to go beyond the government's deficient guidelines, relying on advice that's been provided by their trade unions. And that brought us to the point where we were at yesterday, where parents right across the country agonised about what they should do. Were they doing the right thing in sending their children to school? Those school staff agonised. Were they putting themselves at risk going into that school environment? And we never should have been in that place. It shouldn't have been a question of individual choice for parents who were concerned. We should have had the assurances that their children and staff within those schools would be safe and that those measures would be put in place. And one of the arguments that the government used was that other countries around the world had reopened schools, and they lauded Denmark as an example. And it's true that Denmark did reopen schools, but the situation there was very, very different. They had far more stringent social distancing measures in place. They also worked with trade unions before setting out the criteria that schools needed to meet before they reopened. And they also had a death rate of around 500 when they reopened schools. And we were at nearly 40,000. So it's very worrying, and I know that our schools and our trade unions are doing their very best under very difficult circumstances at the moment to keep children safe, and many schools have opened to just some year groups. There's currently revision, certainly from what I've heard within government, as to whether they're going to open schools fully before the summer holidays, because that was a preposterous proposal. In any event, it would be, you'd be in a situation where you'd have schools trying to socially distance for 2 weeks with a few year groups in, and then throwing that all out the window when they had the whole school in, and it didn't really provide stringent enough safety measures to protect staff and students in those schools. What worried me throughout all of this was that instead of listening to the reasonable proposals that were put forward by trade unions and indeed ourselves in the Labour Party, the government chose to try and whip up what I can only describe as media rhetoric and anti-union sentiment. I'm sure you saw all the media reports about the blob, about trade unions being obstructive, and nothing could be further from the truth. There isn't a teacher or a member of school staff that I've met so far that didn't want to open schools. They just wanted to make sure that those children that they were looking after would be as safe as they possibly could be. And that brings me on to the disadvantage gap. One of the key reasons that the government has used for pushing forward with its school reopening on the date that it has is because of the attainment gap, the disadvantage gap, if you like. And it is true to suggest that during lockdown, that gap will have been exacerbated. But I'd say this to you all, there was an attainment gap before we went into this crisis. There was disadvantage before we went into this crisis, and that was entrenched on the day that a child was born, dependent on where their postcode was and how much wealth their family had. So if the Conservatives were serious about that disadvantage gap, they'd sort it out, they'd tackle inequality, and they would make sure that every single child's family had enough money to live on and provide that secure, safe, stable environment for their children to have that bedrock on which to learn. Now, beyond the coronavirus crisis, because obviously that's what we've been spending all of our time on, there's huge scope for policy development. And as we know, when we come out of this crisis, Annalise has already referred to this, we're going to possibly be in one of the worst recessions that we have ever seen. And that's going to require a response that rebuilds our economy strategically and in acute detail. And that means we've got to have an educational and skills system that provides our people with the skills and the support that they need to get those high quality, secure, well-paid jobs in the future. And that sits alongside a robust industrial strategy, the green industrial revolution, as Sakina has referred to, creating those new industries and opportunities of the future. But I'm very clear on this, and I think we're all clear on this within the Labour Party, that this system, it can't just be about equality of opportunity. It can't just be about social mobility for the select odd person that manages to climb that ladder. It has to be an educational system that's free to everybody, from cradle to grave, so that at whatever point in your life you need that support to climb that next rung of the ladder, you are given that and you are supported all of the way. And I completely applaud the work of my predecessor, Angela Rayner, and her creation of the National Education Service. And that's certainly underpinning everything that I'm doing as part of this brief going forward. And then lastly, because I know that we've got about 10 minutes left before we get the bells going for the vote in Parliament, I was asked to give a little bit of a snapshot about who I am, and I'm sure you're sick to death of hearing from me. I mean, it feels like it was 10 years ago, but it probably doesn't feel like this to members. But myself and Lisa particularly were out there talking the hind legs off a donkey, telling you who we were. But you'll know very much that a lot of my political beliefs came from what happened to me when I grew up. And I wanted to do well. I was pushed to do well by parents who came from backgrounds where they had to struggle. They were very economically insecure and they didn't want me to face that. So I worked hard and I did well. But then when I got to that point where I'd made it and I looked round and I wanted to pat myself on the back, I saw that most of the people that I grew up with hadn't done well. And I realised that it wasn't all about hard work. A lot of it came down to luck. And I don't believe in an economy based on luck. I believe in an economy where you can realise your aspirations and we're all lifted up together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Couldn't agree more with you about the fact that this government has continued to do what legacies of the Tory government has done, which is to undermine the very foundations of the union and the very purpose of the unions, which is to advocate and protect the workers that they represent. And there's no doubt that the work that you've done with the NEU is hugely appreciated by many Labour members. We couldn't agree more that actually the government hasn't been prioritising protecting teachers, just like it hasn't been prioritising protecting our health workers with inadequate PPE, just like they haven't been protecting workers by making some people in the gig economy still go to work, especially, for instance, those in construction. It's great to hear you pull out strands from Annalisa's talk about the fact that if we are going to be one of the biggest levels of unemployment in terms of the countries, then how do we ensure that we have not just a plan to reskill our workers, but a plan on an industrial level in terms of ensuring that we can provide the skills into transition of that just recovery. And finally, we couldn't agree more, the mantra of the Labour Party, which is education must be free for all, access to education must be free for all, the increasing privatisation of our education system, even most recently we saw with the UCU strikes for higher education, means that we will be standing alongside you in this fight, in this new brief that you have, and we're very excited and confident in you leading that fight for us. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Now, before we lose you as well, we're going to quickly give you a question. This time we go to Portsmouth and we hear from Imad. Imad is asking, what is Labour going to do about the inequalities in the education system for Black and working class kids who have fallen further behind due to school closure? Obviously, you talked about the attainment gap in your talk, so if you could just bring a little bit more of that out for us, that would be great. Thank you, Rebecca.
Imad, that's a really, really good question, and there's two strands to this. Firstly, there's what support we need to provide within schools to directly support pupils who come back. And it's not just a question of academic support, it's also emotional support, because even if you've not been through a horrific loss within the family, even if you've not been in an environment that's terrible, an abusive household, for example, or living conditions that are less than suitable, you're going to be emotionally affected. Just seeing the news every day and seeing the rate of death coming through on your television is going to have a profound effect on a lot of young people, and they're going to need a lot of emotional and mental health support, and that's definitely required to underpin their learning going forward. But we've also got to recognise that after 10 years of austerity, our schools and our whole educational system, all the way through from schools to further education to higher education, has been drastically underfunded. And we need to make sure that that resource gets to those schools where they can provide that support directly to pupils. I've talked about things such as an enhanced pupil premium, for example, for disadvantaged children, so that those schools in areas that are of particular need get a lot more money very, very quickly. I've also talked about having an academic system of support that looks at the way young people are assessed to make sure that they're not forced to catch up, because what I worry about coming out of this crisis is that we'll be in a situation where when we go back to school and everybody's in full time, those children who have parents that can afford tutors, they'll be hot housed, they'll catch up and they'll do very well. And the children who live in families that won't be hot housed and they'll fall even further behind. Now, there's a question also about assessments and the way we assess children, and do we keep along the same track where we deal with rote learning, which is what we call at the moment, where you have an exam at the end of 2 years and it's based on what you can remember? Or do we look at a better system that is perhaps a mixture of that, but assesses throughout the year and looks at the strengths of a particular pupil and allows the teacher to be able to do that? But there's problems with that, and we've heard this particularly in relation to BAME pupils over the last few months, when teachers have carried out assessments for GCSE grades and A-level grades, because there is an inherent level of bias in those assessments. And that's why within the system, we need to see full training provided to teachers to identify that bias so that it doesn't happen. I could go on all night, but I know that we're going to run out of time, and you've got the amazing Marsha coming on next, so I'll stop there.
Becky, thank you so much for pulling out particularly the point around bias and the fact that school exclusions, and there have been many campaigns led by Labour activists on precisely this point, so thank you for giving space to that, and indeed talking about the emotional support that children are going to need. Actually, Rosanna Allen-Khan, the Shadow Minister for Mental Health, was on our previous call and was talking just about how actually there's going to need to be a much bigger wave of mental health support for frontline workers, and indeed it's so important that you drew that out on how that's the impacts of our children going back to school. So thank you so much for that, Becky. And like I said with all the other speakers, if we can keep you till the end, that's wonderful. We'll throw some more questions back at you. But otherwise, we understand if you need to dash off. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, folks, last but not least, and by I mean no means least, is the wonderful Marsha Dickova, MP for Battersea since 2017, and our very own Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. Marsha, and very quickly stepped up to the mark to become Shadow Minister for Disabled People under Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet. Marsha has worked on a number of different charities and actually founded the charity charity South East Vision with the aim of ensuring sight loss is not a defining factor for equality and access and opportunity in London, and to increase the awareness of the challenges faced by blind and partially sighted people in everyday life. We are so excited to have you join us, Marsha. Thank you so much for waiting till the end as well, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sakina. And can I say a big hello and thank you for all of you for being on this call this evening. I don't know where you're calling from, but in London, it's still nice and bright outside. As you know, my name is Marsha Calder. I'm the Member of Parliament for Battersea. Prior to coming into politics, I spent a lot of my time in the charity sector, leading on policy and campaigning, mainly focusing on disability rights. Obviously, that's a personal thing for me, but also it's a professional thing. So most of my life has been spent championing and speaking out against the injustices faced by disabled people. My first kind of stint in politics started when I was elected as a councillor in the London Borough of Lambeth, and it was there that you really got to see the impact of local politicians and local decision making and how we can actually improve the lives of people. Sakina mentioned it, but I got elected at the snap general election in 2017. I stood in what was deemed as an unwinnable seat with a Tory 8,000 majority. We managed to overturn that and take the seat back from the Tories, and I was pleased to be re-elected in 2019 as well. It was an absolute privilege to serve in Jeremy Corbyn's team as the Shadow Minister for Disabled People, as I spent most of that time, I think, doing a fairly decent job in holding the government to account on its treatment and the hostile environment that they created for disabled people in relation to social security, employment, but also in aspects of social care. And I'm really proud that in my new role as the Shadow Women and Equality Secretary, I can continue to help shape disability policy as well. As we all know, equalities interacts across all policy areas, across all departments. And, you know, as we go forward as a party, as a movement in making and forming policy, we have to ensure that equalities is at the heart of that, because it's not an add-on. It has to really be, it's got to be integral to what we do. On my appointment, I've had to hit the ground running, really. So aside from getting to know the wealth of different stakeholders, my immediate priority has been the impact of the coronavirus. And we know that the virus in itself has shone a light on those inequalities in our society and the extent of that, the racial and socioeconomic injustices that are happening across Britain. And as we move forward on, you know, as we forge that path to recovery, it really is not an opportunity for us to go back to business as usual. We've got to do things differently, and we've got to address those underlying structural inequalities that have shaped the way that this crisis has actually impacted our society. And, you know, it's my real priority is to ensure that no group is left behind in this. And obviously this includes our Black, Asian and our minority ethnic communities, disabled people, women, and our LGBT plus communities. As we know and as we have seen, coronavirus has disproportionately impacted on BAME communities, women, LGBT and disabled people. And disappointingly today, we've seen the government publish its review and its response to the virus on BAME communities. And I have to say it didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. We know that the COVID has amplified those racial and health inequalities, and that it's the poorest households, the people of colour, that are being disproportionately impacted by it. But when it comes to the question of how they were going to actually respond and reduce some of those disparities, the report was silent. And, you know, it has been so disappointing that the report actually failed to make any recommendation as had been promised. The chair of the report, Professor Benton, spent time with, you know, hundreds of different stakeholders, hosting many a roundtable, talking about institutional racism, talking about the lack of PPE and so forth. None of that is in this report. And, you know, to me, it makes a mockery of the issue of the tragic disparity of deaths among our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And, I think it's almost tantamount to just the way the government has responded to this crisis. In all of their policies, in the legislation, and more recently in their recovery strategy, they have failed to carry out any equality impact assessment. They've really kind of failed in their public sector duties on that in that area, and they need to, and I've tried my best to hold them to account on that. The strategy doesn't address, our BAME communities, our low-paid workers, the impact on women having to return back to work and without the access to adequate childcare provision, as well as disabled people being, disproportionately affected by a lot of the policies within this. In fact, the government haven't done anything in relation to supporting disabled people, which is why I published 10 key asks, which included the uprating of social security for disabled people. It included ensuring that the government had proper signed interpretation at their briefings, which they failed to still do. And again, that's in breach of the Equality Act, and also ensuring that they restore some of the provisions under social care, whereas the government's legislation actually called to suspend local authorities' duties to provide adequate social care. So those asks have been out there, and the government unfortunately have failed to respond adequately to much of that. And again, what we're seeing is the government's kind of laid back approach into how it's dealing with and responding to our protected characteristics. And, it's my job really to continue to try and hold them to account. So in terms of just other areas that I want to be focused on, we obviously the impact of equalities and, post-Brexit, and of the Gender Recognition Act, the government promises to respond to that before the summer. I won't hold my breath, but nonetheless, I want to make sure that Labour are ready to respond to that. And that is really around building a consensus and ensuring that we are bringing our members and our movement along with us as we shape and inform our policy in this area. Last week, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act. And one of the things that I'm really keen on is we've got to ensure that, as we move forward out of the coronavirus crisis, we do not turn back the clock on gender equality, whether that is on issues around women and girls, whether that's around the pay gap. The pay gap has remained stagnant for the last 10 years. Under Labour, we closed it by over 7%. Under this government, it has pretty much remained stagnant, and we have got to do everything in our power to ensure that gender equality is not reduced as we move forward. As we know, with austerity, it's our BAME communities and it's women, it's disabled people that are always going to be hit the hardest. And I believe, it's only a Labour movement, it's only a Labour Party and eventually a Labour government that will actually seek to address those inequalities and create a more fairer and better and equal society. That's me.
Thank you so much, Marsha. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone on this call. We feel very inspired by the plan that you've laid out and indeed by the strength and conviction in your analysis. Absolutely. With the report being released today, and like you said, many of the things, like for instance, the things that point to institutional racism, structural racism, from the fact that inadequate PPE was provided, to who is disproportionately a key worker on the front line, who disproportionately has to take transport, we're lacking and still missing, and the action points are still, they haven't given enough to the voice of the many people that contributed to it. So we're really, really, I think, reassured knowing that you are taking this fight forward and that it's in your hands. And I think you build on your previous brief. And I have no doubt that in your hands, we will be able to hold this government to account and indeed begin to set the agenda, because we know that they are scrambling around and have a complete lack of any ability to set this agenda properly. Even if we just recently look at Boris Johnson's liaison committee conversation around female representation and decision making in the room, it was abysmal. He couldn't answer basic questions on gender equality, and I think that you've absolutely correctly laid out the fights that we've got to continue on this, for instance, like the pay gap. So thank you so much for bringing that to us today. Now, I know we've lost our panelists and you are the last MP standing, so thank you for your patience. We've got a couple of questions we'd love to give you. I don't know how long we've got with you, but I'll start with
I needed to go at 8 as well.
Brilliant. Well, it's up to you. We can quickly throw one question your way if you
Throw
like.
a question. Go for it. One.
Brilliant. What is Labour's plan for disabled people going forward as the lockdown eases and we go beyond COVID-19 crisis? From Io Ithohan from Glasgow. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name.
That's a really good question, and thank you for asking about disabled people. So I believe, and this is something that we're going to be working on, we need to ensure that we have a national disability strategy that encompasses all aspects of policy. Firstly, about incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into domestic legislation, because that then addresses the issues around the labour market, social security, independent living, as well as education. And so those are, for me, that is going to be one of the biggest planks of the policy work that we need to do as a party and as a movement to create a more inclusive society. Because remember, we subscribe in the party to the social model of disability. It is not us that are disabled, it is society that disables us. It's the lack of access at our railway stations, or it's the lack of audio on buses. Those are the barriers that we have to overcome. And by having a convention, the convention incorporated into domestic legislation, and hopefully we can then ensure that we've created a society where disabled people are treated equally and can participate fully.
Absolutely, Marsha, I couldn't agree more with you. The social model of disability is indeed something that we have to embody as we go forward. I recommend everyone on the call go and Google it if you haven't had a chance to get to grips with it. And thank you so much for bringing that to our attention again. I know that you have to run off, so I'll just wrap up and say thank you so much, everyone on the call, for joining. We've had a great evening. It's been great to meet the Shadow Cabinet team who have laid out such an exciting plan going forward about how we hold this government to account, telling us a little bit about how they got into politics, and also preparing us for a Labour government soon come. We will only have that government with our activists on the ground leading the front, and that's all of you who've joined us this evening. So thank you so much for your time. I've been your host. I'm Sakina Sheikh, and thank you to all at the Labour Party who've helped organise this call. It's been great to spend an evening with you folks. Take care and see you on the next one. Bye.